Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to our Tuesday talk show. So today, again, we're going to be talking about Carl Jung, and we're going to be talking about the Persona series. And in this one, we're going to be separating out the conversation about Persona 5 because I've been playing it and I want to talk about it. That's the whole point of this whole thing. But really, the topic I wanted to talk about doesn't really have much to do with Persona 5 as far as I've gotten into the game yet. It might show up later, and I would really love it if they delved more deeply into it, because it is one of the more important elements of Jungian psychology that often gets overlooked, because most people do have more familiarity with the idea of persona, the shadow, and even things like personality types, which aren't directly Jung, but are highly related to Carl Jung. So we're going to be talking this week about the Anima and the Animus, and this is something that's somewhat frustrating, because it's such an important construct within the framework of Jung's psychology, but it's just not really in the Persona series, and you also don't hear people talking about it, and I think it is one of those really, really important things to discuss and to know about and to sort of have a grasp on in terms of how Carl Jung viewed it and how he sort of idealized it. Now, this is one of those topics that can get dragged into some fairly modern issues such as transgender, homosexuality, and stuff like that, but it's difficult to frame how Carl Jung himself would have actually used it in those regards. We have to remember that he lived in a very different time where those concepts were very different from the modern day. So how he viewed those ideas and concepts is extremely different from how we would apply them to now. So anytime that we try to say that these people have these issues based on this Jungian thing is going to be purely speculation, and we can't project that onto Carl Jung or his theory, because he might have a very different take on how those sorts of people fit into his model, or he might reject his own model and change it based on his analysis of those people. So I think that that issue is not really one that is appropriate to discuss in terms of the Jungian framework necessarily, or at the very least, I'm not willing to drag the conversation in that direction. You would want to talk to a neo-Freudian if you wanted to talk about that in that context, because they're the ones that take modern issues and analyze it under that Freudian or Jungian lens. And in this particular case, that's not really what we're here to do. We're trying to look at it in the same sort of way that Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud would have looked at it. And for them, those were just non-issues back then, for as far as they were concerned in their particular theories. So going into this, the Anima and the Animus are essentially, if you're a man, your Anima is your female side. If you're a female, if you're a woman, the Animus is your male side. And to Freud, these are simply elements to the unconscious mind, much like the rest of the shadow and the persona and so on and so forth, residing in this case in the collective unconscious, if I recall. It could either be the deepest parts of the unconscious, or it could be the collective unconscious. I can't quite remember at this point in time. But it has sort of different stages, and like the shadow, you're supposed to confront it. But unlike the shadow, which you simply use as the sort of like first thing that you encounter, the Anima and the Animus is those things that you're supposed to develop over a very, very long period of time, and it's supposed to be one of the big defining moments of your life is how you interact with your Anima or your Animus. Unlike other people, Carl Jung believes that you should find sort of a balance in your life, and this is no exception. If you are a male person by physical gender, physical sex, then he would say that you're supposed to encounter this female aspect to yourself and seek guidance from it. Now, he believed that the way that we treat people of the other gender is based on, in part, how we've dealt with this sort of element of our lives, how we've reflected on this and how we understand our female self or our masculine self. And it also identifies with how we view ourselves and the world around us. And like the shadow, the Anima and the Animus are not purely good things and not purely bad things. Depending on how we treat them, how we react to them, they can also be destructive forces in our own lives against us. And I think that that's important to remember as we sort of go into our two case studies. Now, the case studies are pretty obvious in Persona 4 and only Persona 4, really. We've got Naoto and we've got Kanji. Now, we could make the argument that each of the attendants in the Velvet Room is actually also potentially an Anima or Animus representation of the main protagonist, which might be why there's a male attendant in the only case that there's a female protagonist. But I'm not really willing to stake any bets on that necessarily, nor do they necessarily seem to be reflective of that sort of archetype, because the Anima and the Animus follow a very specific archetype rather than the Shadow, which is based on our internal projections. Actually, the Anima and the Animus must reside in the collective unconscious, because they're always the same. But in any event, to Carl Jung, each of us would have to sort of deal with sort of the same ordeal in dealing with this. But in any event, I don't necessarily think that Elizabeth or Margaret necessarily fit these roles, and certainly not Caroline and Justine, although I may have some theories as to what's going on with them that might make them as separate anyway. But these entities just don't necessarily fit. It would be interesting if it did turn out that that was the case, keeping in mind that I don't think that the female run in Persona 3 is considered canon, so we could possibly ignore all of that content as being not actually having happened and not being part of the core story or the storyline or the way that things work in terms of mechanics. But in that case, we've got really nothing to hinge on other than the fact that all of the attendants seem to be female, which would just be the way that archetype is seen as. So I think that we have to sort of just take a guess that maybe that could be the case, maybe it isn't, but there's not enough information to make that a useful analysis. So instead we're going to turn to, of course, kanji, which is the most obvious example of this. Now for kanji, we're going to be delving into something that's not really the way that Jung would interpret this. Now, for kanji, his shadow seems to have merged with his anima. His female self, his female representation seems to have merged into becoming his shadow, because he is very strongly rejected at a very, very fundamental and core level, his anima, his female self. So by rejecting that and pushing it away and rejecting it, it seems to be assumed that it becomes its own sort of part of the shadow rather than remaining as its own individual construct. And I'm not 100% sure that that's how Carl Jung would have assessed that interaction to be. There's no reason for it not to be the case, though, so it's very hard to interpret once we sort of analyze it under that lens. So in Kanji Tatsumi's case, he ends up having this sort of very strongly effeminate, also homosexual, but that's not necessarily a part of the anima, although it could be elements to himself that he's repressed. And this element to himself is one that he struggles with and he rejects and causes him a tremendous amount of stress. And going off of what we've said so far about what Jung's theory about the anima and the animus is, which is that we're supposed to come to terms with it and we're supposed to actually fully sort of accept it, we can see that this is definitely the case, that he's suffering greatly because he so strongly rejects it. By contrast, we go to Naoto Shirogane, the other case study in this sort of thing. And Naoto is the exact opposite. Naoto has a very fundamental and strong embracing of the animus in her particular case. And this has led her to become, in many regards, what she idolizes, which is these male detectives that she looks up to. And not only does she actually fit the part quite well, in my opinion, most of the people that she interacts with seem to believe that that's actually who she is. Her over-acceptance of this has allowed her to sort of lose track of herself. So this is one of those cases where I definitely don't think that the anima-animus merger with the shadow, or even the shadow, is necessarily as appropriate, and Kanji's was definitely superior. Her insecurities lies within the fact that her true self is actually female, and that causes her sort of grief and so on and so forth. Now, again, in Carl Jung's theories, you're not supposed to reject the true self, and this sort of, again, leads me down that dark territory in terms of modern interpretations of gender, but to him, you're supposed to still accept and understand your own self-identity and your own true self there. Whatever that might happen to actually mean in this terms is difficult to say, and so my interpretation for Naoto is that her true self is actually that sort of masculine macho type, and therefore this conflict is mostly just a projection from her own insecurities, and those insecurities are that she's not actually able to abandon whatever little femininity she still had left. Although I should point out that it's quite evident from your interactions with her, she doesn't fully reject being a woman. It's just that she fully embraces being a man. So this is why Naoto Shirogane, in my opinion, is, despite her own sort of foibles and her own shadow, is much, much, much more well-adjusted than Kanji. If you look at them both interacting with society, interacting with people, it becomes very obvious and very clear that Naoto is capable of acting in a mature, rational way with everyone around her. And this is exactly something that we should be able to predict, because she has sort of embraced that sort of masculine side of herself as a sort of guidepost that doesn't dictate things to her life, but is something that she is able to sort of draw in from, gain information from, and guidance from, and advice from, and still lives herself the way that she wants to, which is, if you interact with her enough, obviously still effeminate in some regards. Kanji, on the other hand, has fully rejected himself, his anima, and therefore every time he tries to do something that fits the mold of what he thinks people look at him and want him to be or expect him to be, that provides tremendous amounts of stress on himself. Whenever he's denying himself the ability to do things that he wants to do because he believes that they're effeminate, he's doing harm to himself there. And lastly, of course, every time that he's doing the things that are effeminate and rejecting himself because of it, or feeling guilt or shame because that's what he's doing, he's harming himself. And this has caused him to have very poor interactions with people around him. And again, this isn't something that we see in the case of Naoto Shirogane. So again, this is something that we predict from the way that the Anima and the Animus work, and the way that we're supposed to go through a particular quest within ourselves to sort of interact with it and to come to terms with it and come to grips with it and accept it. So I think that we do see that in Kanji and Naoto, we see the two different ways that these can be approached and the sort of results that we can see from them. We have to remember that to a certain extent, the shadow is going to always be there for these people. So the fact that Naoto goes in there and has these sort of points where she has that sort of difficulty with herself and with her self-identity, that's not really reflective of her, even in her worst moments in the real world. That's really only brought about by that sort of very psychic constructed world that's able to sort of build up around that. And even then, if you actually take a careful look at the levels and so on and so forth, it's her own immaturity that is her shadow. It is less that sort of gender identity, but more the problem seems to be like it's a big fanciful science base. It's got that sort of vibe to it. It's got sort of the robot aesthetic to it. It's got these children's toy sort of ideas behind it. So I think that her age actually ultimately makes her more self-conscious in the sense of the shadow than her gender does. And again, this is because I think her gender really isn't as big of an issue to her as I think you could be led to believe otherwise. And while it definitely is one of the big key cornerstones of her identity is that struggle with that, I think she's come to terms with her identity much, much better than Kanji has. Now, again, this is something that I would really love to see more of in these Persona games. This is the only time that we really see it. And again, we see it amalgamated with the shadow in a way that I don't find quite satisfying. I would definitely love to see them be a separate entity within the game world somehow or another. Now, how that would sort of happen would be a little bit difficult, but I definitely think that that's something that could be something to explore. That would be something that they haven't really done in a very strong way yet. Naoto and Kanji are good glimpses at the concept, but they don't even really identify that concept as being part of the Anima-Animus theory. So we're not really seeing quite as much out of that as we could in their particular cases, and this is why I can't really go too much deeper into these case studies. Certainly there is definitely more that could be discussed, but discussing the Anima and the Animus is more or less about a sort of pseudo-mystical journey that Jung would say that you undertake on a personal introspective level. And this isn't really something that lends itself to good science, so it's very hard to hypothesize or test anything or even really apply it to proper case studies because it simply isn't a scientific theory. As much as I do love Carl Jung and his work, it's not necessarily always the best science. And again, I would say that Freud was definitely more of a scientist than Jung was because of stuff like this. But at the same time, I think that if you were going to apply it to case studies, Naoto and Kanji, as you sort of progress discussing with them and talking to them, reveal more and more about that sort of idea as they sort of go through it. Kanji certainly by the end of it comes to some level of acceptance to it, and it sort of makes him more mellowed out and more adjusted. Naoto doesn't really have to do that much with that. Actually, her character arc is less to do with that and more to do with her discovering why she was so passionate about this work to begin with. So it is more about the job as opposed to the gender in her particular case. And I think that's appropriate, again, because kanji, that is the defining feature of his problem, whereas for Naoto, it's not really. So anyway, that's enough talking about Persona 4 and the Anima and the Animus. Let's talk about Persona 5. So Persona 5 is perplexing me just a little bit here because there's so many leads and elements and tells in it that are telling me that there's something different going on here compared to the other Persona games. And I'm sure that someone else out there knows exactly what it is, or if that's all red herrings. But like, there's one of the things that happened between Persona 4 and Persona 5 was that Igor's voice actor died, which is sad in its own right because he was an amazing voice actor. But the problem with this is that they've replaced him with somebody that sounds so dissimilar that had I not known that he had died, I would have assumed that this was a different character completely. Now, I know that since his voice actor did die, I had assumed that maybe they would have potentially hired someone that sounded similar if they had wanted to, but I don't know if they couldn't find anyone that sounded satisfying enough in a similar way, so they just went for a completely different voice, or if this is to indicate something very different or dramatic has changed about Igor, or if it's a different character entirely. Certainly there's a lot of tells about his role and what he's telling you that are very different. For instance, we have not yet signed a contract with Igor, which is something that's been a crux of the Persona series since 3. He keeps telling us things that are very, very different. In 3 or 4, what he tells us is that we have to be responsible for our actions. We are allowed to decide what we do, and we are responsible for the outcomes. In Persona 5, Igor is telling us what to do, which is to be rehabilitated so that we can end the ruin, or stop the ruin, which is very different in tone from 3 or 4. And you can't really argue that 3 or 4, he's not saying that because he has no stakes in it. He's an observer, and in both of those cases, the world would have in some way ended. So it's not as though the consequences are any less dire in this particular case, or at least they don't seem to be. I don't see how they could be. So him actively pushing you to do something in particular without telling you to take responsibility for it is very uncharacteristic of Igor. The fact as well that he talks about things like aesthetic. Aesthetic is sort of the core identity of something in some ways, but it's also more or less talking about the way things look. But he's telling you that you've found people who share your aesthetic, for example, but he's not telling you that sort of that you're looking for people who share the self or share reality or what have you. It's just a very shallow facade that he's saying that you share, I guess. And that's fine because it's the Persona series. That's to a certain extent what you really are looking at is the facade of these people. But at the same time, it's very different in terms of the tone of what Igor is about and what he usually is doing. So I can't help but feel that there's something very, very different about that. But again, it might just be me biasing that way because of the difference in the voice actor. Had the voice actor for Igor survived and been in this game, I probably wouldn't be thinking about this line of thought at all. But that also does lead me to talk about the fact that, I'm pretty sure other people probably have mentioned this, but you are capturing personas, and they mentioned that they're not actually shadows, they're personas. Really, there's no difference between the two of them in terms of anything other than where they reside within the unconscious or conscious mind. So the fact that you're sort of acknowledging them is why they become part of the conscious. Now, I don't think that personas necessarily reside per se within the collective unconscious like they mentioned, but maybe that is how they are supposed to work. Actually, no, I think that they are supposed to work like that. They're taken from the collective unconscious to a certain degree, but it's kind of like the mechanics of that within Jung psychology are kind of wonky. But yeah, I've gotten far enough to sort of really question exactly why it is that the personas and the shadows are so different, but not really to get any answers regards to that. I think that to a certain degree it's because it allows for honestly more interesting encounters, since the encounters in Persona 3 and 4 with a lot of the generic shadows were kind of dull, honestly. With this, it kind of makes them more interesting and relatable. It also brings us back to Persona 1 and 2, where that was the mechanic. That was what you fought, was other personas. And then you can negotiate with them to cause them to join you. So that was just simply something that has been in the Persona series before and is coming back. So I'm not sure if there's a deeper story reason behind that being back into the game, or if that's simply just the way that they're just going back to the sort of style there. The other thing, of course, is that sense that each of the characters is definitely coming in tune with their inner rebellion, which I feel is more their shadow than it is their persona. And again, I don't think that means that their persona is a shadow. That would definitely not make sense to me. But I definitely feel as though they themselves are becoming their shadow whenever they're in the palaces or what have you, to a certain degree or another. And I'm kind of also wondering about some of the hypocrisy of their actions, because it definitely does feel as though they're sort of trending into a territory where it would be very easy for them to become hypocritical, in a certain sense there. And I'm wondering if that's the way that the story is going to lead and is going to develop towards, or if they're able to sort of keep their perspective and their goals in mind while they're doing everything. Because when you've got the ability to change the world, it's very easy to do so under your own terms and assume that what you're doing is righteous and just, but that's not really much different from the way the villains view the world either. Quite often they're ones that view it in the same sort of way in what they're doing, and that conflict can sort of arise. Now, there are objectively people who are going to be wrong about what they're doing as being just or what have you, depending on your view of what justice is. I happen to view that there is a concrete definition and concrete way of being just, and that some people obviously violate it. But other people view justice as simply being subjective, in which case, obviously, anyone could simply say that their acts are just and their goals are just and so on and so forth. So, it's going to be very difficult to determine, I think, the morality of this until it sort of probably hits you with a sort of surprise hit there. I definitely feel as though this is a game that is going to have lots of twists and turns to it. In particular, there's got to be some sort of twist, because you start the game 6 months into it, essentially, and are playing essentially the first 6 months of the game after that. She mentions right off the bat, it's like when you joined the school 6 months ago, which is a huge giveaway in this game. Every Persona game since like 3 has been 1 year. You've got 1 year to complete the game, except if you choose the bad ending, in which case you can end these games several months early. I suspect that if I play the game incorrectly, by the time I get to the 6-month period where I end up in that interrogation, which is how the game starts off, I'm going to end up game overing at that point. It's going to be the bad ending or what have you. On the other hand, if you navigate correctly and make the correct choices, each of these games lasts for 1 year. So I think they've given a huge tell that whatever sort of debacle you're in at the center of the game, at the start of the game and throughout the first sort of part of it where you're sort of flashing back through the activities that led up to it, they're definitely sort of leading you on to the idea that that is not actually the ending point of the game. And I think that we're going to be seeing some interesting twists from that sort of idea there. And yeah, I'm enjoying it so far, although I have to admit, like, the antagonists in this game sort of piss me off in like all the best ways, because it's pissing me off in an engaging way. Like, you want an antagonist that you can really want to see them sort of fail. I think that a lot of games make their antagonists sort of ones that you sort of want to emulate or what have you, or you think they're cool or what have you. I haven't really found that to be the case in this particular game. Like, even some of the villains in Persona 3 were kind of interesting. Like, Revolver Jesus was pretty interesting, actually. Very interesting, cool aesthetic, and so on and so forth. That sort of died off in Persona 4 to a large extent. But in Persona 5 here... Well, actually, no, Persona 4 had Shadow Naoto, which is, like, the best thing ever. So... And Shadow Teddy, which is also pretty good. But barring those two, you know, I think that Persona 5 has gone to the route of making the antagonists look like real dorks, and in a very strong and deliberate way, while also making them extremely hateable. So it's kind of interesting to see a game where I think that not only are the bad guys very despicable, but I've not gotten really no hidden desire to root for them like a lot of I think a lot of people do root for the villain in a lot of certain things where they just think that the villain is more powerful and more cool and more impressive than the others. That's really definitely not the case in this particular game, and I think that I kind of appreciate that considering how much I hate them. On just a fundamental level. I just have a very strong bias against people who abuse systems like the law and stuff like that. I'm not an anarchist. I actually am extremely bent on keeping law as a sort of like priority. Like, I don't believe at all that people should step out of line. The thing is that I believe fully that if these institutions that are keeping the law are not held accountable, then it is the civic duty of people to like literally get up and kill the people who are using those institutions incorrectly, and replacing them with ones that are. That is, I think not just a right of the people. I think that's a responsibility of the people, and one that has been ignored in this real world a little bit too long, honestly, in some respects. But, corruption's going to always be there, so I guess it would be unrealistic to have civil wars every single time there is the first whiff of corruption within government, because otherwise there'd just be constant fighting. So yeah, a little bit impractical, but that's sort of my thought on the matter. When things get really bad with institutions that are abusing power, and which you cannot remove because they're in power and that power allows them to protect themselves, then violence is going to have to be the cause of getting rid of them. And so on that level, I very much sympathize with the main characters in this game and the way that they sort of are dealing with this through sort of a brute force way. But at the same time, you do have to wonder how far they're going to take it, because again, when you're able to act in that sort of vigilante manner and no one's able to sort of put any repercussions against you for doing it, then you have the much greater potential for corruption without those checks and balances in place there, and those protagonists there. Well, other than the fact that they get caught at the very, very beginning of the game, there's really no checks or balances against what they're doing or their powers. So we'll have to see how that goes. I think that conflict between freedom and order has been in the Persona series for a long time now. It actually was the original conflict in Persona 1, if I recall correctly, and it's almost always the framing for Shin Megami Tensei games, which is also the same company. Typically speaking, they're not about good and evil. They're about order and chaos. And typically speaking, order is not necessarily any better or nicer than chaos is. However, in the Persona series, you almost always tend to be fighting for order. This seems to be the opposite case here, and I'm not necessarily sure what that implies. That, again, might mean something different is going on here, though, with the characters, with the way the story is structured, and with the plot, and so on and so forth. It would be really interesting if you actually were fighting against the sort of forces that you normally are fighting with in the Persona series. So yeah, we'll have to see how that all goes. Anyway, hope you found this episode enjoyable. As always, I hope to see you guys all next time.